I would like to welcome everybody here tonight. I'm Lori Gazzillo-Kiley, Berkshire Regional President for Berkshire Bank, and I'm pleased to be here with you this evening to welcome you to this program, which is the second in our four-part series. And it's ironic, I will say, with the news that was just recently announced about the verdict in the Derek Chauvin murder trial, that we're talking about moving from I to we and coming together in America. It's important conversation and something that we at Berkshire Bank prioritize. We're guided by our Be First core values, which are belonging, focusing, inclusion, respect, service, and teamwork. We embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice as pillars of excellence critical to community and organizational well-being. Berkshire Bank has a 175-year history of serving businesses and customers from all walks of life. We're a bank with a purpose to empower the financial potential of people, families, and businesses. Financial institutions, and in particular community banks, have an important role to play in addressing racial wealth disparities and building more equitable communities. They have a responsibility to utilize their products, services, and capital. I'm proud of the steps Berkshire has taken and continues to take alongside our community partners here in the Berkshires. We're proud to support tonight's conversation and look forward to listening and learning alongside each of you to build a stronger, more equitable Berkshire County. I would like to thank Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation and the Berkshire Eagle for developing and hosting this program. And I will now turn it over to moderator, Peter Taylor, President of Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation. Peter?
Thank you, Lori, for Berkshire Bank's partnership, along with our partnership with the Berkshire Eagle to produce this forum series. It's a privilege to moderate this discussion with our distinguished speakers and the audience gathered tonight. First, I want to acknowledge that the jury in the Derek Chauvin case has spoken and found Mr. Chauvin guilty on all charges. We can hope this result signals the start of a new day for racial justice. I also hope that the moral outrage I felt as I listened to the testimony, as I suspect you did too, can help us mobilize the leadership, will, and resources to address systemic racism and continue to acknowledge and find ways to remedy past injustices. As we will learn tonight, moral outrage in response to disparities was catalytic in bringing together coalitions in the early 20th century that were successful in creating change through organizing and policy. Creating change is on many minds right now. Many of us here tonight might say that we have experienced living in an American society in recent decades characterized as going in the wrong direction, considering persistent racial inequities and growing economic disparities, political polarization, social detachment, and self-interest. Today's speakers, Dr. Robert Putnam and Shaylin Romney Garrett, will illuminate how we've gotten to where we are by examining historical cycles in economics, politics, society, and culture over the last 125 years. The authors will show that during the period starting at the end of the Gilded Age to the mid-1960s, American society shifted from being focused on individual rights and self-interest to one more focused on shared responsibilities and shared prosperity. Since the 60s, however, we've shifted back to a society focused more on self-interest than community well-being. This arc, which the authors call the I-We-I curve, forms the thesis of their new book, The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. They argue our most important task now is to bend this history in a more promising direction. And as we will see, lessons from America's past tell us that youth and younger adults, or today's post-boomer generations, will inevitably lead such a turnaround. A note about the format. After a short primer from our speakers on the main findings from their book, we'll open up for discussions, starting with two recent college graduates and a staff member from Berkshire Community College, who will share their ideas for changing course. We'll also invite your questions through Zoom's Q&A features, which is at the bottom of your screen. Let me now introduce our speakers. Shaylin Romney Garrett is a writer and award-winning social entrepreneur. She is a founding contributor of Weave, the Social Fabric Project, an initiative of the Aspen Institute, a public policy center in Washington, D.C. Shaylin previously collaborated with Robert Putnam and David Campbell on their book, American Grace. Robert Putnam is the Macklin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, and past president of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Putnam has written 15 books, including the much-read Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. In response to Bowling Alone, Dr. Putnam worked extensively with community foundations across the country to conduct research used to experiment with promising practices to increase civic engagement, including a project with the Maine Community Foundation where I once worked. It's a great privilege to have Shaylin and Bob with us this evening. Bob and Shaylin, welcome to the series and virtually to this region. I was fascinated by your analysis when reading the book, and I recommend the book to all whom are participating. Can the two of you provide an overview of the key findings for our audience in order to tee up the discussion tonight?
Sure, we can. Shaylin, shall I start, and then you can
Sure.
come along? First of all, Peter, it's a delight to be with you all virtually. I wish that we were together personally. Secondly, this event was obviously not planned. Knowing that the Chauvin, the trial would end today. Indeed, I should tell the viewers that the book was written not knowing the George Floyd event would happen. The book was completed more than a year ago, long before the pandemic, long before the economic collapse, long before the Black Lives Matter movement, long before George Floyd's murder, and long before the politics of this year. We obviously want to talk a lot about what's happened in the last year, and especially we want to talk tonight about race. But I want to begin, if I can, with the discussion of the book, which is a book of history, and which does address race. And I want to assure all the listeners, we're plenty ready to talk about race. But I want to get a running start by talking about the historical context, including the historical context of race. So can we have the next slide, please? These are the facts seen historically. And I repeat, our book is not about the last 2 days or even the last year or even the next year. It's about the last 125 years and what that can tell us about where we could go going forward. But we're looking in broader historical terms and not at the events of any particular moment. And seen in that historic context, America is, as my mother would have said, in a pickle. We are, first of all, more polarized politically than we have ever been. Almost, it's a close call between where we are right now and where America was between 1860 and 65. That's a measure, and those are the only two times we've ever come close to this level of polarization. Secondly, and independently, we're in probably one of the most, we're in the period of greatest economic inequality. The gap between rich and poor is larger now probably than it's ever been in our history. We are very socially isolated. It's a little harder to measure that, so it's a little harder to get long-term trends, but I think we'll show you in a second. We're astonishingly, compared to our own past, socially isolated, lonely. And finally, we're more self-centered almost than we've ever been. So the first question is, how did we get here? How did we reach this plight? If we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you quickly some pictures. It's just easier. If you don't like pictures, that's fine. I'm going to say what the pictures say. But if you do happen to be one of those for whom a picture is worth 1,000 words, that's why the pictures are here. They all have the same shape. So let me spend just a second describing the shape. The horizontal axis runs in all cases from the end of the 19th century, roughly 1880, 1890, 1895, and it ends today in 2020. Indeed, I'm going to say a little bit at some point about what it looks like in 2021. So really today. And the vertical axis and the trend show, and what all these charts show you is how four characteristics of society have changed in America over this period. And in the first case, we're going to talk about political comity, or the degree to which people get along politically, cross-party collaboration, versus polarization. Polarization is simply the opposite of getting along politically. And we've set up the chart so that up is always good. And in this case, what you see is over at the far left-hand corner of the graph, at the end of the 19th century, America was very, very polarized. And what that means is people didn't, there was almost no cross-party collaboration. The political party system in America in that period was essentially a pair of tribes competing against each other. And if that sounds familiar, that's not an accident. But gradually, over the course of the first couple of decades of the 20th century, America began to cooperate more politically. A few more coalitions began to appear across party lines. Now, we're still pretty polarized in that period, but we're moving in a less polarized direction. And as you can see, that trend goes up steadily through the 20s and through the 30s and through the 40s and into the 50s. If we pause in the middle 50s, which probably I'm the only person on the call who can remember the middle 50s, but you will have heard of the president then in 1955. That's when this graph hits its peak. It was Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower was except for George Washington, the least partisan president in American history. He was almost nominated by both parties. He was almost nominated by the Republican, he was nominated by the Republican Party and almost by the Democratic Party. And he himself thought there ought not to be parties. He just thought, there ought to be one party. So Dwight Eisenhower did not cause this. He was a symptom of the fact that America in that period was not very divided in political terms. And as you can see, that continued for a little while into the 60s and in the beginning and even into the beginning of the 70s. But then suddenly the trend goes in the opposite direction. And the trend here is very simple. Every year we got less and less cooperative across party lines. Every year we had more and more Republicans versus Democrats rather than Republicans and Democrats. And as you can see, that was true through the 80s and 90s. And now a couple of you are beginning to appear on the scene. And when you come into the scene, we've already been going downhill in terms of party polarization for 20 or 30 years. And we keep going down, keep going down, keep going down, keep going down. Stop back up just maybe there. A little bit before then is when the students in this audience come into the picture. And as you can see, America has been going in the wrong direction for an awful long time from your perspective. And that trend keeps going down, more and more cross-party fighting, bickering. And if we show the graph up to today, you're all aware that it keeps going down further. It hits way down at the bottom, actually even below the bottom by the time we get to 1921. We're way down. No, keep going down, way down. That's about where we are today. And you can see what I mean if I ask you what fraction of what fraction of Democrats today vote with the Republicans in the Congress, and what fraction of Republicans vote with the Democrats in Congress. And that's now virtually zero. It's mathematically impossible to become more polarized than we can. Whereas back at the peak, there were lots of votes that divided the parties, 60-40, 60% of one party cooperating with 40% of the other party. Okay, let's go quickly. Now, that's the way all the graphs are going to be. I can be a little quicker now as we go forward. Here's the trend in economic equality. The data here don't begin quite as early. They begin in 1913 because that's when the IRS started collecting data on people's incomes. And you can see that when the curtain rises, so to speak, on the economic data, America is very unequal economically, way down at the bottom. But then in the first decade of the 20th century, we begin to become a little more equal. Not perfectly, and then almost right away, as you can see, there's a dip in the 20s. That's the so-called roaring 20s, when a lot of people made a lot of money in the stock market and then lost it. And beginning about 1928, 29, America became steadily more equal through thick and thin to go up, through the 20s and through the 30s and through the 40s. America becoming more and more equal, the gap between rich and poor steadily shrinking. And steadily every year, more opportunity for kids from the bottom to rise to the top. And there's a little bit of a pause after World War II, but then it continues up and up. And as you can see, it goes up through the 50s, hits a peak in the 60s, but stays at a pretty high level in the 60s and 70s, and then suddenly reverses and we begin to have less and less equality, more and more inequality. And that trend continues. And down, 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 up, stop, wait a minute. If we were going to get to the end of the graph, again, everybody in the room knows what's happened to inequality in the last couple of years. It is that we are now, the inequality has grown even more rapidly because of the pandemic and because of the Trump tax cuts, and put the dot down on the, keep going way down to the bottom. It's down there. I'm telling you, my mom would be right. She'd say, we're in a real pickle. Almost never has America been this polarized and this unequal. Let's go quickly to the third slide. If we have okay, here we're going to look at social cohesion, what I, in a book called Bowling Alone, refer to as social capital. It's just the degree to which we're connected with one another, the degree to which Americans year by year have been connected in community organizations, connected in their families, connected with their neighbors, many different measures. All of these charts have behind them many separate measures which all tell the same story, which is why it's just as simple to show the composite index, which is what each of these graphs are. And you can see here again, at the end of the 19th century, Americans were quite separated, and Shailene will say a little bit more in the minute as to why we were, but then again, in the beginning, the first years of the 20th century, we begin to become more connected. And you can see every year by year, we're more connected with our families, more connected with our communities, more trusting of other people, more likely to go to church, and so on. There's a pause there in the 30s, coming out of, in the 20s, the same one we've seen before, but then coming out of that period, and especially beginning in about 1940, probably the greatest civic boom in American history. Every organization in America had people flooding into their organizational meetings, and social trust was keep going higher and higher. I'm talking up now to please go a little with the marker, go a little higher. This is a period I'm talking about up there at the peak. Everybody's getting married. Of course, that's the baby boom. Everybody's having kids, and they're getting married early, and they're trusting everybody else. It's quite amazing from today's perspective. Now, sorry to pause for just a second. In none of these charts do I mean that the peak is perfect. It's not, and we're going to say a lot more about why it wasn't perfect up there, but it was a lot better than it had been, and as we'll see right now, a lot better than it has become, because beginning in the 1960s, suddenly we start being less socially cohesive. And if you'll trace the graph down, you can see that trend going down in the 60s, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, et cetera. It just keeps going down. And but that means, if if you think in ordinary terms, it means fewer and fewer people are getting married. They're getting married later. They have fewer kids. More, and they're dropping out of organizations like bowling leagues. That's where the name for that book was called Bowling Alone. They're dropping out of organizations. They're not know their neighbors as well. And as I say, they trusted one another less. Let's have the next slide, please. And here is a measure. I wish we had time to talk about the methodology here, the mathematics underneath it. I won't, although if somebody wants to push me on this, I'd love to, because I would love to tell you about the background of this graph. But it's, as you can see, this is a measure of the degree to which we feel as a country connected with one another or not connected with one another. And low means we're very individualistic. We're all about the individual, all about I. And you can see we start off at the end of the 19th century very much focused on I. But then once again, as you enter the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, Shailene is going to say a lot more about what was happening behind this curve, but we begin to become a little more connected, and steadily through the teens and 20s, there's a bit of a pause there again, that pause during the 1920s, but then it keeps on going, up, steadily more, less and less focus on I, and more focus on we. And for that reason, actually, we came, as you'll see in a second, to call this curve the I, we, I curve. At the beginning of the century, Americans were very focused on I. By the middle of the century, we began to be focused more on a we, that we share things in common. The nature of that we, of course, and its racial composition, is it a broad we or a racially defined we? That's something we're going to talk about very quickly. But you can see that the trend begins to stop. And the second half of this, just as in all the other charts, we gradually become less and less focused on what we have in common and more focused on what separates us, what divides us, what defines the me. And we're back down to a me. Let's go to the next slide quickly. I'm conscious. Lots and lots of interesting questions in the chat line. Unfortunately, if I take time to respond to those, I won't get through this talk quickly enough to allow time for the questions. If we could have, so this is very simple. I just put all those charts in the same graph, and you can see they're not 4 separate charts. They're one chart. And if we could have the next slide, please. This chart summarizes what we call the I curve. We start off over there, very America at that period is very unequal economically, very polarized politically, very isolated socially, and very self-centered. And that you can see rises steadily until the middle of the 20th century, about 1960, and then suddenly sharply turns back down toward a society that is less equal, more polarized, more socially isolated, and more focused on I. Now, what all this means is the question that Shailene is going to pick up and talk about now. Shailene, why don't you take it from here?
Sure, thanks. So, Bob began his remarks by just indicating the mess, sort of the multifaceted crisis that we're in today as a country. And, ours is not the first book to address the question of how did we get here? In fact, one reviewer of our book noted that there's an entire genre of books that he called the "How We Got Into This Mess" book genre of books that really try to explain why we're in the state that we're in as a nation. And I think that it's important just to note that, many of those books that have asked that question have really focused on this period of the downturn, the period of the last half century when sort of everything seems to be unraveling or falling apart. And our book, we believe, is a bit different in the sense that this is not a look back to a supposed golden age in American history. As Bob mentioned, we do not think that the peak of this graph, mid-century America, was in any way perfect. It just happens to be the moment that by these very hard statistical measures, we came closest to being and enacting a we as a nation. That does not mean that we was perfect, and we will get to that in just a moment. Again, the other way in which our book is different is that, again, this is not a Make America Great Again thesis. How can we get back to this supposed golden age? On the contrary, what we're interested in is the moment in history that most closely resembles the moment we're living in today. And that moment is back at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. That Gilded Age was remarkably, even breathtakingly similar to the America that we are living in today, not just in the sense of statistics, but in the lived reality of the Americans of that time period. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I just would encourage you to get the book and read the introduction, in which we detail the breathtaking number of ways in which America was in the same place in the Gilded Age as we are today. And so we believe if ever there is a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the moment when we made that turn from I and began moving in the right direction, in the direction of we. The message of our book is simply that we have weathered this storm once before and we can do it again. And so we look to that period, of when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era as a moment when we could learn some lessons about how we could set in motion a similar sea change that we can see in the graph here. So if we can just go to the next slide. What I want to do with the remainder of our time here is to just highlight some of the lessons from that period. Now, before I get into this, I just want to pause to clarify that when we use the term progressive, we're using that in a historical sense. We're not using the term as it's used today. Today, we might hear the term progressive, and we would call that sort of a small p progressivism. That's the kind of progressivism that is defined as defining the leftmost end of the political spectrum. That's how we think of progressivism today. The progressivism that we're talking about, historically speaking, is what we might call capital P progressivism. It's the progressivism that took hold in America, that those very opening decades of the 20th century. And it was a very broad movement, a bipartisan movement. Historians have even called the progressive movement a movement so diverse as to be barely coherent. so it was a movement full of lots of competing factions, people of all different classes participating in this, people from all different walks of life with different goals. But all of these reformers were really united by a couple of things. They had a compelling desire to repudiate this downward drift, this crisis that they found themselves in, and they had a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to make change. So what are the lessons that we can take from this movement? I mean, what would we have to do today in order to see a similar upswing to the one that we saw in those charts? Well, when we look back on this statistical story, and again, in this book, the statistics really form the backbone of the story that we're telling. We're really trying to give a data-based lens in which to sort of re-understand the 20th century. And when we tell this story that's very based in these statistical measures, oftentimes people say, well, if you could just identify the leading indicator, then we would know what drove everything upward. So we have all these 4 trends, and each of the 4 graphs that Bob presented represents scores of underlying graphs of individual measures, all of which sort of turned in that direction at roughly the same moment. So people often look at that and say, well, which of them turned in the right direction first? Because then we might know what was the thing that pulled everything up with it. We might have some idea of what the silver bullet for reform would be. And a lot of people actually assume that that silver bullet is economics. They assume that we fixed our economic inequality problems first, and that made us feel more united, and that made us feel like we were more in this together, and that pulled everything upward. One of the biggest surprises of this data is actually that economic equality was a lagging indicator. That means it was one of the last things to change in terms of those 4 curves. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that fixing inequality is not important. It's extremely important. However, it does mean that doing that first, focusing on that as the thing that's going to drive us in the right direction as a nation, may not be where we need to look in order to get this broader upswing in motion. So if economics was a lagging indicator, the question then, of course, becomes, what was the leading indicator? It appears from both when you sort of pair the data with the historical record, that it was really a moral and cultural shift that led the change. The first thing that began to shift was culture. What did the culture look like during the Gilded Age? Well, it was characterized largely by something called social Darwinism. At the time, Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest, which was a theory to describe the natural world, was a relatively new idea. And of course, Darwin himself believed that it would just apply to the natural world. But there were people who looked at that and said, well, if that's how nature works, then this should be how society works. That we should organize society as a giant competition, and only the strong will survive, and the devil take the hindmost, and that's how it should be. Darwin himself did not subscribe to this theory, but it was a very popular cultural belief at the time. So this social Darwinism led to this dog-eat-dog world in which you had the robber barons, and the destitute poor living on the Lower East Side of New York and other similar places. And it was in that context that a group of reformers came onto the scene that began to challenge that idea of what society was all about. And that movement was called the social gospel movement. It originally came out of evangelical Protestantism. It came out of a rethinking of actually the theology of Christianity, which, at the time was portrayed as this sort of good Christians are living in these shining cities on top of the hill with the unwashed masses below. And there were many preachers and theologians who began to say, this is not the gospel that Christ preached. And furthermore, this is not the way that a society should be organized. They leveled a moral critique against the social Darwinism and began to replace it with an idea that society was not a competition, but rather a collaboration, that society was about taking care of our most vulnerable. It was about what we could do for each other and what we could do together. And this was a movement that really was characterized by moral outrage and moral indignation. But it wasn't just finger pointing. It wasn't just saying, the robber barons have caused this problem, and if we can expel them from our society, we will all be fine. On the contrary, it was a movement that was driven by what I like to call chastened elites, people who directed that moral indignation inward and asked themselves how they had been complicit in creating this multifaceted crisis in America. And it was that sort of heart change and cultural change and moral change that seems to have happened earliest and really drove a lot of the other changes that we saw in very different parts of American society. So that's a really important lesson we feel for today. Those who are coming onto the scene and putting moral frameworks and moral language around the choices before us as a society, we think will be the leading edge of change. Another lesson here about this movement was that it was driven by youth. Those of you who might be familiar with the progressive era history, you tend to think of people like Jane Addams, but often we see pictures of her. Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House in Chicago, we see pictures of her in her twilight years when she was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, and we often forget that she was doing her most important work when she was under the age of 30. This was an incredibly youth-driven movement. The poster child for progressivism was Teddy Roosevelt, who was the youngest president ever elected, the youngest person ever elected to be president of the United States. So this was a movement that was incredibly innovative in its approach to social reform. That innovative energy was driven by young people who were living in an entirely changed world from that of their parents. And we believe that young people today, those post-boomer generations, will be the key to another upswing. These reformers who were working to change America at this time, they were really prioritizing what they would have called association. That's kind of an antiquated term. We might call it relationship or connection or community today, but they were really seeing that it was imperative that we bring people together. They began to recognize that hyper individualism that Bob illustrated, that we can measure, through very hard measures. We could see that America was a very lonely, isolated place. And to a large extent, that was because the progressive era came on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, when it was a huge demographic shift in America. You had a generation previous living on farms and in small towns and working for small businesses where everything was very personal. And then a generation later, you had, millions of Americans living in big, bustling, anonymous cities where everything was commerce driven and people felt like cogs in these massive corporate machines. And so the reformers of the progressive era really began to realize that they had to invent new ways to bring people together in an entirely changed social landscape. And so that big civic boom that you see illustrated in the graphs, that was driven by young people who began to say, I don't know how to get to know my neighbors on the Lower East Side. Maybe I'll invent something called the Rotary Club to bring together people and have lunch together so that professionals can meet each other. Those are the types of organizations that were invented during this period. So when I say association was an end and a means, it was an end because people were lonely and they wanted to bring people together to meet their own needs. But also they began to see the power of association building. And the Rotary Club's a great example of this because it started as a way to just bring lonely professionals together. And then they suddenly realized that they could band together to do social service projects and to sort of improve their city. And as more and more people joined, they began to take on a more pro-social and civic mindset and to begin to do things to change the cities in which they were functioning. And so that social capital became a means that drove this upswing for decades. One thing here to note from this period is that this was a very grassroots movement. Again, when talking about leading and lagging indicators in the data, it's very clear that charismatic leadership, those national political leaders that we think of like Teddy Roosevelt, they actually were a lagging part of this story. They really saw a parade and then got out in front of it and figured out a way to take what was bubbling up from the grassroots and translate it into national programs that could have bipartisan appeal. And so it's really important to understand that the energy of the progressive movement came from the grassroots. Even though the progressive movement is famous for its accomplishments, such as child labor legislation and trust busting and all these big things that happen nationally, there were many people in municipalities and neighborhoods who were experimenting with these solutions very early on, and that's where the energy came from. So there are a lot of really positive lessons to learn from this period that I think, we can apply today if we want to see another upswing. But I want to just conclude my remarks with highlighting a way in which the progressive era offers some cautionary tales. Not everything that the progressives did was great. Not everything that they did was right. Not everything that they did brought about change in the right direction. And we highlight multiple of those sort of cautionary tales in the book. But the one that I want to really focus on today is simply that the progressives were constructing was not inclusive enough. Of course, this we period, this upswing corresponded with Jim Crow in America, a very dark, long, dark period in America's history of race relations. And largely the progressives themselves, these chastened elites, were racist. Their circle of moral concern just simply did not extend to people of color. And so a lot of the reforms that they put in place, though they did drive America in the right direction in very measurable terms, they also had knit into them the structural racism that we are now having to reckon with today. So in a sense, the progressives sort of kicked down the road the project of racial reconciliation in favor of doing sort of taking the easier road of progressive reforms that did not take into account the deep racial reckoning that America needed to do. And so any upswing that we would want to see today cannot make that same mistake. We absolutely have to put full inclusion at the heart and center of any we that we would hope to build toward today. And the hope is then that we could reach a higher summit of we than we did this last time. I want to get to questions, and so there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm just going to leave you with this parting thought. If we can go to the next slide. There's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that we love because we think that it really captures the message of our book. He said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together." Whether we lean into the power of we or not, it is ultimately America's superpower, our ability to come together. And I think today our hope is that we can recognize we've done this once before. We've gotten out of a mess like the one that we're in once before. We can do it again, and we can do it again with a greater focus on inclusion in hopes that the next upswing that we see today will be longer lasting and more true to America's core values than even it was the last time around.
Thank you, Shaylin, and thank you, Bob, for such a provocative overview that provides such good fodder for questions and discussion. I want to encourage participants in the forum to put their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Before we bring the college students in for discussion, I want to ask you a question first. You noted, Shaylin, just there at the end of the presentation that the we society that was building in the upswing was fundamentally flawed because it was exclusionary on race. How does the story of racial inequality map to the I curve that you document, and that was at the heart of last century?
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? Because I want Shaylin to answer that question, but I want your viewers to know what Shaylin's going to be discussing was in the book that was written 18 months ago, because we're meeting on the night of George Floyd. You might have the impression that this is a layover, that we're just trying to make our book relevant to tonight. And all I'm saying is we've been aware of this problem that Shaylin's going to now talk about for long before the Black Lives Matter movement. That's all I'm trying to say. But Shaylin, go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Peter, for bringing that up, because of course this is the absolute first question, especially on a night like tonight, is, how can we talk about a we in America without talking about race and without really reckoning with the ways in which America's we has been extremely exclusionary. So I want to just say, we've presented this story that's based on all of these graphs, right? And oftentimes we refer to those graphs as an inverted U curve, right? It looks like a rainbow, right? Things got better and better and better, and then worse and worse and worse over the course of this 20th century. So what would a graph look like that would try to capture America's movement or lack thereof toward racial equality and inclusion? Well, a lot of times people assume that what that graph would look like is not a, better, better, worse, 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 but rather a hockey stick. We sort of have this assumption that all was sort of exclusion and lack of progress for for 2/3 of the century, until sort of the lightning bolt changes of the civil rights revolution. And I should say that it's mostly white Americans that have this assumption, right? Not Black Americans, because Black Americans know that they've lived a very different story. But I think a lot of white Americans sort of assume that America didn't really change a lot when it comes to race relations until the 1950s or 60s. And it's important to recognize that on a lot of measures, this is actually true, particularly measures that capture exclusion versus inclusion, right? So that's things like the longstanding lack of political representation for Black Americans, white supremacy, just generally in our culture, as well as in mainstream media representation. To a certain extent, things like residential segregation fit that model. Long-standing lack of entry into professional schools and professional jobs is another example. So there are a lot of ways in which there really was no change until the civil rights movement came and broke those barriers. But inclusion and equality are not the same thing. And so what was interesting to us is as we looked at all of the data on Black-white progress over the course of this period, we saw a very different looking shape when it comes to equality. Now we're talking about specifically material equality between Black and white Americans. And I want to make clear that the only reason that we are talking just about Black and white Americans is simply because there is no longitudinal data that covers the period that we're talking about for the full book that takes into account other peoples of color. That's simply because they weren't measured as distinct groups consistently over that entire period. So it's really hard to draw conclusions that map onto this full time period with other groups besides African Americans. It's not because we don't care about their plight or because their story is not important. It's simply because this is the data that we have, and this is a very data-driven book. Actually, I think we have another slide, if we could bring that PowerPoint back up, that will show what this graph actually looks like. So this is a summary of Black-white material equality, the progress toward equality between the races on material measures. So things like life expectancy, infant mortality rates, high school completion, college graduation, earnings per worker, wealth, home ownership. And this measure even includes things like voter registration and voter participation. So these are really important measures of equality between the races. And we're looking at how fast and when did America move toward equality. So we have that same time horizon on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis here, you'll see it goes all the way up to 1.0. And that would indicate full equality, right? So it's very clear from this graph that we have never come anywhere close to full equality between the races. But I want to just look at the timing of when progress took place, because I think for us, when we looked at this data, we were surprised, right? That actually the greatest progress toward material equality for the races actually took place before the civil rights movement. So I don't know if we can bring up the pointer there, but if we can, you can see that the fastest gains for Black Americans were actually between 1940 and 1970, right? Which I think is really surprising. Again, surprising to white Americans, not to Black Americans, because this is sort of, you might say, the contours of their own genealogy, right? And so that's one surprise, is that the fastest the fastest progress toward material equality between Black and white Americans took place before the civil rights movement. The other surprise here is that where that pointer is essentially when civil rights legislation passed, and what was already a trend going toward equality, you might have assumed would continue to go up until we got even closer to full equality after the civil rights revolution. On the contrary, and tragically, we entered what we call in the book a foot off the gas period, a period in which progress stagnated. And on the individual measures that underlie this index, sometimes there was even reversal. For example, home ownership rates amongst Black Americans are lower today than they were in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. College graduation rates are lower today than they were in the 70s. So this is a story that has two parts in the same sense that our we, I story has two parts. We have the part where we were sort of moving more in the direction of we, and then we have the part where we were moving more toward I. And I think the main message that we want to highlight here is that it's interesting that the moment when America takes its foot off the gas in terms of driving toward racial equality is the same moment that we turn more generally toward individualism, toward a focus on I. So it's not entirely clear, that one thing was driving the other, but it is interesting to note that the we decades were highly racialized. They were highly exclusionary, but at the same time, they were more hospitable to progress in terms of material equality than the I decades have been. And in a way, you know, this is the story that the movement for Black Lives is trying to hold up for everyone. The movement for Black Lives is not just about police brutality. It is not just about police murdering Black men and women. It's also about the fact that these communities in which these murders are taking place have been in a half-century stagnation period. There has been essentially no progress made on these measures in the wake of the civil rights movement. And that is an extraordinarily frustrating reality that I don't think white Americans fully take on. I think there's a sense that, like, oh, we sort of solved like the race thing with the civil rights movement. Like, what is everyone so upset about? And as I was listening today to Attorney General Ellison, in the wake of the verdict, he cited the Kerner Commission report, which came out in 1968, and he cited a particular expert that was interviewed by the Kerner Commission. And that commission essentially, you know, attributed the racial rioting that was happening at the time to this very sort of stagnant ghettoization of Black Americans. But that expert said, you know, this is the same cause of the riots that happened a generation ago. And Attorney General Ellison was saying, you know, this is the same cause of the protests that we're seeing today. So again, even though progress was made during the we decades, and it is important to take on the fact that a we mentality, even though it is racialized, is more hospitable to racial equality, at least in the material sense, we certainly have not done the underlying heart work to really deal with the racial reconciliation that needs to happen in this country. And so I think that, you know, this data, again, as Bob said, you know, we discovered this data well before George Floyd and the sort of 2020 movement of the Black Lives Matter movement. But the data here tells the story that Black Americans are trying to hold up for the nation in terms of accountability of what has and what has not happened in the wake of the civil rights movement. So we can be defined more inclusively and more exclusively, of course, and we have not yet solved that puzzle of how to create a fully inclusive we in America, but we've done better and worse, and a hyper-individualistic America that is focused on the I doesn't do well in terms of making good on the promise of we. So those are just a few thoughts of you know, there's so much more we could say. There's a whole chapter in the book on this, but that's just a quick overview.
Well, thank you, Shaylin, for providing more details on that important aspect of the curve. And indeed, there's so much more work to be done. You noted in your presentation that the generation now in their youth, Generation Z, will be instrumental in providing the leadership and the activism to bend the curve, to get us into a more positive direction. And so we wanted to bring in two perspectives from two recent college graduates to engage in this discussion with the two of you tonight. And so I'm pleased to introduce those college students. The first is America Lopez from Berkshire Community College, and Olive Schaffner joins her from Columbia Green Community College. This section of the program is going to be moderated by my good colleague, Eleanor Velez, who serves as the director of the Multicultural Center at Berkshire Community College and also is in the admissions office. Eleanor is also a board member at Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation. So welcome, Olive and America and Eleanor.
Thank you, Peter. And obviously, it's a very exciting night, not only to be discussing this incredible work that lets us see history and hope in the future, but also because of things that are happening in our society. And as you said in the book, you talk about who is the people who usually inspire us and help us move forward. And clearly, we know it's the youth. And we're very happy and lucky to have two amazing young women from community colleges in our neighborhoods who are going to be addressing some questions. But first, let me introduce to you America Lopez. America Lopez is a mother, a community activist, and originally from Mexico. America just graduated from Berkshire Community College last April, virtually, and with a degree in liberal arts, and she's and a concentration in social work. America has been working very hard in the last year, hoping to be able to transfer either to Smith College or Mount Holyoke College. At the same time, America works as a volunteer, as a community health worker in Volunteers for Medicine, And in her free time, she has volunteered to work with the Hispanic community and the migrant community, and is a co-founder of a very important group that started during the pandemic called Latinas 413, that at this point virtually has 242 students. And also she's working with the Hispanic and immigrant community in developing something called Liderazgo Inmigrante. So it's exciting to have America here. And at the same time, it's wonderfully exciting to see Olive Schaefer. Olive is, she just graduated also from college, just in December, also virtually. But she started her journey at Columbia Green Community College. She graduated from there in 2019, very quickly moved forward, transferred, and she used her early childhood education with an emphasis in education, not only to continue her academic journey to get a bachelor's degree at the University of Albany in English, but to go back to her alma mater, Columbia Green Community College, where she's currently working as a marketing assistant. And both of them are really an example of that upswing that we're hoping to see in our communities, and people who have adjusted to live in a world that where we seem very disconnected, they find ways to stay connected. So America, would you please ask your question?
First of all, it's very nice to meet you, Shannon and Dr. Robert. So in chapter 5, you talk about individualism versus community. And you mentioned that at the heart of the progressive era was the idea of we rather than I, or what you like to call communitarian sentiment. And you also mentioned that among some of the important figures in this country was this shared idea of mutual collaboration or assistance. Rather than charity, which can be considered very patronizing. So I'm an immigrant, as Eleanor mentioned, and I've been in this community for over 16 years. This is home for me now. And for most of my life, I've been a very community-oriented person, and not because I choose to be, but because I had to be, right? I was taught to believe that change starts at an individual level, but it doesn't stop there. You have to go out and do things for your community and grow with your community. And it's for that reason that I'm the co-founder of these two groups that Eleanor mentioned. And one of them is to empower Latina women here in the Berkshires. And the other one, it's called Liderazgo Inmigrante, and we are very focused on the immigrant community. So when I was reading this chapter that I mentioned, it reminded me of how we think and what we do without knowing. We think on we terms. We don't think on I terms. And I think it's because at the heart of what we do, we know that there's power in community, that it's better to do things in a group rather than doing them alone, because it will take so much effort and time. So my question for that is, during this short life of our groups, we've noticed that even though we consider to be us new immigrants contributors to this country, that sometimes the support that we have received from some people can feel at times like charity rather than really support. And sometimes that's fine, but sometimes we would like to be part of this community, of this larger community. So my question would be, what would it have to change on, like, what cultural shift will have to happen for us to have a seat on the table that really allows to share our voices and our desires and have an opportunity to genuinely be heard and be part of the larger community and be seen as contributors rather than asking for something.
Yeah.
Shannon, can I start off on that?
Yeah, please.
First of all, America, wow, what a story. Your own story. And I actually wish you could just spend a lot more time telling us about your story, because it's extremely inspiring.
Yeah.
And if you'll forgive me, I want to add that key members of the progressive movement, key members, not just people following, but the key leaders, were young, immigrant, non-white. They were seen by people then as being non-white girls, that's what they were called, in the garment district of New York City. They were, I don't say the only people, but they were the driving force. Many of them were from Southern Italy. Many of them were Jews from Russia. They were from all over. They were all immigrants. Almost all of them today we would say were white, but at the time, American society did not think of them as white. They thought of them as colored or as non-white. And they were the leaders. And I urge you to look into the history of that part of the movement, because they're exactly your predecessors. I don't mean you're a union organizer, but you are a young, smart, immigrant woman of color. And those were key people the last time we went around. Now, let me say something specifically about your specific question. And I'm going to be extremely brief because I know we're running out of time. The distinction that you're making is a really important, that is between charity and participation, is a really important one and goes way beyond the issue of immigration. It's a distinction that's often framed in terms of doing for or doing with. And almost all the people, and certainly we, but almost all the people who know about periods of progressive change, understand that while doing for is nice, you don't get real progress unless you get into doing with. Does that make sense, America? And as it happens, tomorrow, Shailene and I are going to be talking to a group about exactly this issue. Precisely this issue, doing for or doing with. We're talking to the executives of something called Salvation Army. Now, I won't go into great detail about the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army began as a participant organization. It did not begin as a place that collected donations and you gave your old clothes to them and then they gave the old clothes to somebody else. They've become doing for, but they were originally doing with. And the reason that why does the Salvation Army want to talk to Shailene and me? Because they think they should move back away from doing for and towards doing with. They want to get in touch with their own history, because they were a creation of the progressive era, the period we're talking about now. And so the larger point I want to make here, and I'm sorry, I've said too much and not enough. The issue you're talking about is, quite apart from the immigration side of it, is absolutely crucial. And so we're doing our best, but it's going to really devolve on people like you and Olive and other younger people to make that clear, that it's nice to do for, but it's crucial to do with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and could I just add a brief couple of thoughts to that, which is, Bob is so right to highlight the Salvation Army, because so many of the movements that came in this moment of American history were exactly questioning philanthropy. They were questioning how philanthropy itself was done. And so they were thinking of new ways to do it. The Settlement House movement is my very favorite example of this, where the founders of that movement were specifically reacting to a previous era in which that was defined by something called noblesse oblige, where these sort of wealthy elites would bestow their, donations upon the poor, right? And they came in deliberately to try and put on the ground a different model. And they had a very strong mutual aid mindset about working with immigrants, and that it was a mutual learning experience, not a one-way learning experience. And that actually evolved out of the settlement movement over time. As it evolved into a professionalized movement where they started treating people like clients and they started taking big donations of government money and other things, their whole model shifted. And so I think you're exactly right on to say what we need is a redefining of how we are serving with the underserved, not just serving for. But the other thing that I think you bring up, and I will just say this, I want to bring it out because it's super important. There is a critique of the racialized we that we're talking about in this first 2/3 of the century, in the sense that it was a we that was really defined by white maleness. And it was about bringing everyone into that idea of what it meant to be an American, in a sense, right? And that's not, I do think that what we need today is a completely new redefinition, a new North Star for America that's not just about a sort of upper middle class ideal of the American dream, right? But really looking to communities of color to help us redefine America's core values, right? I mean, what are America's core values? Like, I think that that's a really important conversation that needs to be had. I think the most interesting people having that conversation are communities of color. And I think that's where the conversation starts. It's not just a conversation that starts in white America and then we bring in voices of color. I think the absolute opposite flip needs to happen. And that's where we're going to get a real energy behind what is that new summit that we're working toward. So I really appreciate you bringing that out. And I also appreciate that you were introduced first as a mother, because I think that that's such important work. And that's another illustration, right, of how we define success and other things in this country. So thank you for that.
Thank you all for just such a wonderful and engaging conversation. I know that we would like to have more time, so we'll be quick and jump into Olive's question because it's extremely important as well. Thank you so much.
All right, my question begins with, in chapter 4, you explore the rise and decline of civic associations, which followed the familiar inverted U curve found throughout the book. This section was particularly interesting to me because when I was growing up, I wasn't really directly involved in a lot of clubs or organizations. Instead, I usually turned to online communities to find connections with people and sort of I went through that. And I think this is especially relevant to the current period because we've all sort of made this virtual shift over the last year. So my question is, do you believe that it is possible to recreate the values and ambitions of former civic associations and groups online today? Or do you believe that the introduction of the internet has permanently deteriorated the ability for such associations to form and be sustained?
Shannon, can I take
Yeah,
that?
There's so much to say, but
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob. He's got
so
on this.
that's a terrific question. And I have right here a 45-minute answer to that question, which I'm not going to use. I'm going to try to give it short, but it's a big question. It's a big, broad question. So here's the first thing. There's been a lot of, until very recently, there was a lot of cyber optimism around. That is forget about bowling leagues, Facebook or Twitter or something is going to be much better than meeting face to face. And I would say that attitude lasted until last November 25th. That is Thanksgiving. And by Thanksgiving, everybody had realized seeing grandma on Zoom or seeing your grandchild, this is me, your grandchild on Zoom, is not the same thing as hugging your grandchild. That is, there are advantages to it. I mean, if we didn't have the virtual reality, we would be, we had no contact with our family and friends, but it isn't the same thing. And it basically is not as good. But the second thing that I want to say is that it's false, you didn't do this, but many people do, to act as if there's two choices. We can have a virtual reality or a face-to-face reality. But almost none of us is in our social networks are in either an exclusively face-to-face world or an exclusively virtual world. Almost all of us are in networks that are simultaneously face-to-face and also virtual. And in framing this, I find it helpful to think about alloys. Alloy is a metal that is made of two other metals. So you put together, I never can remember this, but you put together copper and tin or something and you get bronze or whatever. But the main point is bronze is different, totally different from either copper or tin, if I've got my metals right. And what I'm trying to say is these mixtures of face-to-face and real connections, they're not sort of like even a mixture of the two. And so all of the interesting questions, I think, here are about how can we use, it's not about how can we replace one by the other, it's how can we use internet technology to broaden and deepen and in many ways enrich our face-to-face networks, but not replace them. I don't know if this makes sense, if the alloy concept makes sense. I want to make one last point. Forgive me, Shaylin, for going on so long. One of the other things that we've discovered in looking at the internet is that technology is not like some external force that forces itself on us. Technology, I'm going to put it a different way, we will get the kind of internet we want. We'll get the kind of social networks we want. If we want to watch cats all day, I assure you we'll get a cat-focused internet. And if instead we want to have a social networks, social media and so on that focus on helping our neighbors, if we want that, we'll get that. And this is a broader point. Forgive me, Shaylin, for going on here a little bit long, but it's a much broader point beyond just the internet. And it's almost the place that it's not like I want to end this discussion, but it's an appropriate way to end this discussion. If we have one point to make, especially to young people, it is that history has not determined where we're going to head. It's what would otherwise be called agency. That is, you can decide, and I mean you, Olive, and you, America, and Eleanor, especially young people. You could easily be cynical because you didn't cause this problem at all. And that was true of the people 100 years ago, right? They didn't cause the problem. They fell into it. And you could say, not my problem. But that's not what they did. What they did and said was to think we can actually change history. We're not fated to be just stuck in the place that we found ourselves. And I'm getting a little bit on my soapbox here or even sermonizing, but we both feel this very strongly. The whole reason we wrote this book is because we wanted people like you and the others here, we wanted to convince you, you have the power. Exactly. We didn't write this for somebody else. We wrote it for you. You have the power to change it. I'm way too old and Shannon is getting on in years compared to you guys. We can see the problem because I can see because I lived through. I was once before in the other on the other side of the wheat period, but I can't fix this problem. It's only going to be young people like you, but you can. That's the core idea here, and I'm speaking to everybody, both the panelists here and other people. I'm sorry, Shannon and everybody else. I went on too long.
No, I just want to highlight something that actually is Olive's own insight, which I think goes to your point, right, Bob, about that this generation is going to be the ones to change. Olive, your question was really, how do we recreate the strengths of those organizations from this previous era and make aspects of those part of our online experience, right? That is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that we need, right? These were huge organizations, but they were chapter based, which meant that people knew each other and there was accountability, right? And you couldn't just leave the group whenever you felt like it, which is what you can do on Facebook groups. They're anonymous, right? They were often place based. They were funded by the members themselves who paid dues. They weren't funded by these outside corporations or organizations, right? And so that type of thinking, how do we create the technology that takes these big, broad, anonymous Facebook groups that people look to for connection and reformat and reconfigure them to actually look like the chapter-based organizations of a previous era? And I can say, just based on a little bit of consulting work that I've done with Facebook, they really are asking these questions from a design perspective. How do we design the group's platform to be able to have these aspects built into it? And whether or not they'll make good on that commitment, how seriously they take that versus just making money, that's all another question. But I do think there's a huge space for young tech entrepreneurs to come in and reshape what online groups look like, and using those groups from another era actually could be a very fruitful place to look for ideas of what really matters in terms of groups that create strong bonds of social capital that exist not just online, but also offline.
Wow, that was amazing. And I know that everybody who's listening is excited about the questions and the answers and the potential interactions. I know there's people online wanting to ask questions. I have questions too, but we'll leave it to the people online because obviously we could stay here with you for a much longer time and hopefully we can find a way to do that. So I'll pass, but I'll say this is very, very exciting, and I'll give it to Peter. Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eleanor. And indeed, that was a wonderful exchange. So thank you, America and Olive, for such wonderful questions that sparked such a lively discussion. I do want to honor quickly, and we hope to end in about 10 minutes, but I do want to honor the audience questions and draw one from the chat. And the question is this: why the reversal in the pursuit for greater racial economic inequality in the 70s? And what can we take from your analysis that will prevent us from taking our foot off the gas now when there is such importance being placed in catalytic energy around greater equity and inclusion? So what can we learn from the 70s that we don't want to repeat now?
Go for it, and I'll come in later, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it into 2 words: white backlash.
Right.
Here's a story of what happened in the 1960s. As we built up to that historic moment when America changed its laws and broke down these de jure, exclusions, Americans by and large, including white Americans, were largely in support of that civil rights legislation. They felt it was time. They were ready for it. We'd spent decades building toward this expanded sense of we. And then the minute that those passed, I mean, literally, it's scary how quickly you can see this in the survey data. When the Johnson administration began implementing integration and doing things that actually meant making good on the promise of that legislation, white Americans instantly said, "Not in my backyard." And so what that says to me is that you can't actually legislate morality, right? Like you can't just sort of change the laws and expect that underneath it hearts will have changed, if that makes sense. And so I do think that to an extent, yeah, and the other part of the story is that the white backlash that we saw in the 70s was not new. There was a huge, white backlash after Reconstruction. And so for Black Americans, it's like this story keeps like replaying over and over again. We make progress and then white Americans say, oh no, we're going to take that away because we're not ready to share the pie, right? And so I think, again, how do we get to a situation where it's not just white Americans holding all the cards and encircling the wagons, right? How do we get to a place where we're working towards a we, that everybody's at that table? And this is not something that has some easy glib solution. I mean, we're not sitting here saying like, oh, we can solve this tomorrow. This is a really difficult project to create a mass multicultural democracy. No one in the world has ever achieved this yet. But I believe that we can do it. I think if we learn from our history what we got right and what we got wrong, and recognize that we have fundamentally not done the moral work of racial reconciliation, if we can start it there, we might have some hope of getting somewhere. And I really think that this, the verdict that came down today in the George Floyd trial is a strong indicator that we are finally getting there. And let's just hope that this is the very first piece in a shift that's going to actually begin to change the hearts that need to be underneath the legislation and the programs that change.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I actually, since I lived through the 60s and the Civil Rights Revolution and so on, I can just add a little bit of word. There are differences, as you well know, Peter, between that period and this period. There's a high risk. And basically everybody my age, their first thought when we saw the Black Lives Matter movement last summer and were cheering for it was, oh, but wait a minute, we know how this story ends. So that's the backlash. But actually that isn't quite true this time. And partly it's because this time Black folks have partners. I mean, white partners. And that's especially true among younger people. There are a lot of white younger people who are wholeheartedly in support of this. I'm not trying to say, once again, that white people are going to be the saviors here. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, unlike the last time, I'm hopeful, actually, that this time will be different, because we know that the racial attitudes and the racial experience of younger people, by which I don't mean just teenagers, I mean people in their 20s or even maybe in their 30s, but certainly people in their 20s, their whole lived experience is a multiracial society. And that wasn't true before. And so I think, yeah, I recognize the risk. If I were Black, I'd think, oh my God, once more around this. We've been around this before. We got, as Shailene said, we were held out the hope during Reconstruction, but then came the aftermath of that. We were held up the hope during the Civil Rights Movement, but then after that. But I am hopeful that it's different this time. Well, we'll see. I mean, actually, and today is incredibly emblematic of that. If large numbers of white people think that the verdict in Minneapolis was a victory for us white people, as well as for Black people, that'll be a good sign. But if the only people think it's a victory are Black people, they're right, of course, but that's a less optimistic outcome.
Well, thank you both. Bob and Shailene, I share in your hope that we are in a period where indeed we will have resolve and a moral imperative to not take our foot off the gas and achieve, the hope of full racial equality and equitable communities for all. And I want to thank you for giving us the historical perspective in terms of how we have gotten here and what contributed to it and what we can do looking forward to bend the curve and to move towards a more positive direction. A very provocative and informative discussion and lively Q&A with our terrific college students with America and Olive. So I want to thank them. I also want to thank you for your inspiration that your scholarship is bringing in terms of how we can go about to bring about change. And I think if you look at the chat and the comments listed, indeed you are leaving people better informed and inspired that at the local level we can indeed bend the curve. So thank you so much. I want to conclude by again thanking our fantastic young leaders in Olive and in America, and for Eleanor for moderating that part of the session. It was in many ways the highest point of the discussion. And I also want to thank our sponsors in Berkshire Bank and Berkshire Eagle for working with the foundation to make this forum series possible. And with that, I want to turn it to Fred Rutberg, who is the publisher and president of the Berkshire Eagle, to say a few concluding words and to talk about the remaining two forums in the series. Fred?
Can you hear me now?
Well, I can't unmute.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a real honor to be part of this series, along with Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation and Berkshire Bank. It was an incredible conversation we had tonight. We talked on a very, very high philosophic level. Next meeting, which will be 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to bring it down to a more basic level. We're going to talk about the media, how the modern media can either create divides or bridge divides in our community. We have two great guys coming to talk with us. Alec McGillis, who is a Berkshire County native from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He's a writer with ProPublica. He's written for the Washington Post, New Republic, Baltimore Sun. He's won a bunch of awards, and he has a brand new book out now called Fulfillment. And it's going to be a bestseller, I think. No matter what, it's being reviewed and talked about in all kinds of places. And Alec will be joined by Charles Sennett, who is the founder and CEO of the Ground Truth Project and Report for America. And Report for America has been sending reporters into various places across this country that has not had news reporting. So he has a very, very broad perspective on what's happening in the world of journalism. And this is this is a big part of how we're going to bridge and heal what's going on in our communities. As the speakers tonight said, you got to change attitudes first, and the only thing that's going to do that is the presentation of the full story, the real story about what's happening in the world. And hopefully we'll delve into that a little bit next time, which is 2 weeks from tonight on May the 4th. So I want to thank everybody. We're a little late, we're a lot late. And so for a wonderful discussion. Again, thanks to all these organizations, especially Berkshire Bank, who I forgot to thank last time. So be well, everybody. And we'll see you on May 4th. And I think they're going to put up a screen that will tell you how you can sign up right now for the May 4th. If they don't, it's Berkshire Eagle /Series 3, berkshireeagle.com/Series 3. So thank you and be well. Take care. Good night.